In today's tutorial, we are going to cover how to do cycle-accurate NES emulation inside of Retroarch. Let's dig in. So the first thing we are going to need for our NES emulation is Retroarch. So head on over to retroarch.com, click this download button, go ahead and scroll on down to the bottom to this Nightly Builds tab. And then you are going to choose what platform you are using Retroarch on. So today's tutorial is covering Windows. If you have something else, this tutorial might not apply to you. So I mean, you can try to follow along, but it might not have the core we're using here today. So I'm going to click on Windows, x86-64, and then I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. And I'm going to click on this retroarch.7zip. If you don't have 7zip or would prefer just a automatic installer, you can go ahead and click on the setup.exe. I don't personally use that because I just like telling it where to go without a launcher. So here we go. Now, if for whatever reason you try to launch Retroarch after you get it downloaded and installed and it doesn't work, go ahead and scroll back up here to this redistributable zip and go ahead and download that, extract it, run it, install it, and you should be good to go to run Retroarch. After Retroarch is downloaded, go ahead and get it extracted to the directory of your choosing. For my demonstration, we are going to be using the desktop, so I'm just gonna go ahead and pull it out right here. Now, as I say in every tutorial, just make sure Retroarch is where you want it to stay before you launch it. Otherwise, you're going to have to go in and reconfigure all the directories, or just delete the config file and start from scratch anyway. So best to make sure it's where you want it the first time and avoid any troublesome issues. And now that Retroarch is fully extracted, we're going to go ahead and open up that folder and scroll down to the bottom and double click on retroarch.exe. And welcome to Retroarch. Yay, it's so pretty. For my personal taste, I like pressing the F key on my keyboard here to full screen up Retroarch. Next thing we need to do is get our Nintendo Entertainment System emulator. So we're going to scroll down to Online Updater. You can use the arrow keys on your keyboard, or if you happen to have a controller plugged in, you can use the D-pad or thumbstick. We're going to click on Core Updater. And I'm going to press right on the keyboard to fast travel down to the Nintendo section. Alright, so Nintendo-NES, here we are. So the emulator we're going to choose for today's tutorial is going to be Nestopia UE, which stands for Undead Edition, because this is a fork from the original Nestopia. So this emulator is cycle accurate, and it has a crap ton of options that you can configure to your personal taste. It's really interesting and really neat. So once you have that downloaded, go ahead and press backspace or B on your controller. And we're going to go ahead and quit out of Retroarch because there is one little bit of setup here if you want to play Famicom disk system games. So go ahead and quit Retroarch, load back into your web browser, and go to retroarch.com once again. And this time we're going to click on this Docs tab for users. So they just changed their layout around, so it's not the Docs for documentation page anymore. It's under Core Library Emulation. So we're going to go ahead and find Nintendo Emulation, and we can see a nice compatibility list here. So if you're interested in figuring out what emulator is most compatible for things, you can see a nice little thing right here. So for our use, we're using Nestopia. You can see there's only one game that has issues with this emulator, so you should be fine to play practically everything. If you're having issues, most likely it is your ROM file. But anyway, go ahead and scroll further down here, and we can see Nestopia UE right here. And this gives us all the background on the core and information on what file systems it uses. But what we're looking for is what we need to name our Famicom Disk System BIOS. So it needs to be named disksys.rom. So if you want to play Famicom Disk System games, you do need that file. I don't have any Famicom Disk System games. I do not own the system, so I don't have that. But once you have that file, you name it disksys.rom and you put it into the system folder of Retroarch and you are good to go. But there is one more thing that Nestopia needs to run, and that is this nstdatabase.xml file. So just go ahead and click on that. It'll bring you down to the the wiki entry for the NST database.xml file, go ahead and click on this link to GitHub. And once we are here, we need to download this repository. So go ahead and just download the zip. And once you have that zip downloaded, go ahead and get it extracted. Open up the folder. And we need the NST database.xml file. So go ahead and copy that and paste it into the system folder of Retroarch, and you're good to go. So if you want to play Famicom Disk System games, you need that BIOS file in the system folder with our database file. So just as a heads up reminder of that, make sure you have both files if you were wanting to play Disk System games. Since I won't be doing that in today's tutorial, I only have the database file. The next step of the process is obviously getting NES games. So you have games, you're already set. If you don't have games, you can dump your own using a Retro 2 or any other hardware dumper. So I have a set of NES games here. They're all in NES format. I have one zipped because Retroarch will be able to use them unzipped or zipped, so it doesn't really matter. If you want to save a tiny bit of space, you can go ahead and zip all these guys up. Just like that. Now that we have our system folder set up and we have our NES games, let's go ahead and load back into Retroarch. So from here, we're going to go down to load content, and we're going to browse over to the directory that we have our games stored in. So in my demo here, I'm on the desktop, so desktop NES games, and here were all my NES games once again. So now we're just going to go ahead and try loading a ROM, make sure everything is working as it should. So I'm just going to go ahead and load up Zelda 2, and I'm going to hit load archive since it's a zip folder. And sure enough, everything's working exactly as intended. And that's basically it. That's everything you need to play NES games on Retroarch. But of course, my tutorials never end there. So if you're interested in seeing a couple more extra steps, go ahead and stick around just a bit longer. But for those of you that just want to get NES games up and running as quickly as possible, you are all set. Go have fun. Enjoy yourselves. For the rest of you, stay tuned. Alright, so now that we know that we have our NES games up and running and we don't have to worry about anything like that, let's go ahead and make life simple for all of us. So instead of having to go down to the load content menu all the time, which really sucks, let's go ahead and set up a playlist to make our lives very easy. So normally I'd show you how to do it with the scan directory thing, but you know what, that's just a waste of time. Let's go ahead and go down to show desktop menu. And that brings us to the wonderful desktop menu of Retroarch, which lets us do a lot of fun things. So, first thing we're going to do is we're going to right-click on this little sidebar here. We're going to click on New Playlist. We're going to type in Nintendo Entertainment System, and don't mind my broken USB cord on my controller, it's getting pissed at me. But anyway, once we're done with that, it gives us a nice Famicom picture, oddly enough. And then we're going to go ahead and add our game folder. So my game folder is once again on my desktop, NES games, add folder. We're going to tell it that it is for the Nestopia core, and the database is Nintendo Entertainment System. If you're making a Famicom Disk System playlist, you're going to select Famicom Computer Disk System. And then we're going to click OK. And there are all of our games that were added in, and as you can see, it added in the zipped games that we made earlier just fine as well. So now we can go ahead and directly launch a game from here to ensure that our playlist is set up correctly. And sure enough, we are good to go on the playlist. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and full screen Retroarch. And now we're just going to go ahead and press escape to exit completely out of Retroarch. The reason we need to press escape is because we need Retroarch to close and reopen for our new playlist to show up in the Retroarch main menu. So now we're going to go ahead and relaunch Retroarch. And we're going to press left on our controller or keyboard arrow key. And we have a nice NES playlist all good to go. And you can just press enter or A on any of these games and they will now launch. But that's not all we could do with this playlist. Let's go ahead and take it a step further and make it a lot prettier. We can actually add each individual game's cover art to this playlist. So that way when you scroll over the game, the cover arts will be displayed and it just looks a lot prettier than this. So we're going to go ahead and press right on our controller or keyboard to go back over to the main menu. We're going to go to Online Updater, and we're going to go to Thumbnail Updater. And we're going to press right on our keyboard to scroll down to Nintendo, and we are going to go ahead and download the Nintendo Entertainment System zip file. This will take a minute, so bear with it. Once that download is complete, go ahead and back out of Retroarch once again, because we're going to need to rename some files depending on how your playlist is set up. So for my playlist, I don't have my games set to the good set ROM naming scheme, even though they are confirmed good by the games, good set. It makes Retroarch's thumbnails a little mad at me, so I have to go in and manually rename things whenever I want them to appear. So I'm going to go ahead and quit out of Retroarch. I'm going to scroll up to the thumbnails folder, Nintendo Entertainment System, named Box Arts. And you can see here are all of the box arts for pretty much every region of NES games. So I'm going to go ahead and take 1942, get rid of the region code. Good to go. I'm going to go ahead and do the same for Bayou Billy. Going to get rid of the and region code. So you're going to want to do this with every game in your playlist as long as you want it to have cover art, but instead of taking up more time, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it at with these two for now. So once you have that done, go ahead and open back up into Retroarch. And now when you go to your playlist tab, you're going to see some wonderful cover arts that have now been added in when you select the game. So now that we got our playlist set up, let's go ahead and go over some of the core options available in Nestopia, and there are quite a few, so let's go ahead and dive in. So you're going to want to press F1 on your keyboard to bring up the in-game menu. This lets you reset, save states, do everything in the backbone of Retroarch. So we're going to go ahead and scroll down to Options. And this is where all of the fun stuff comes into play. First option we have is for some Ntsc Filters. This lets us choose between our image as no filtering, so it's just pure emulation, or we can make it look like it's running on Composite, S-Video, RGB, or a black and white TV. So this is pretty cool. We're going to go ahead and cycle through a couple of these real quick. So for comparison's sake, here was disabled. Now we're going to do composite. And as you can see, we got that wonderful composite look where there's a lot of color bleed and maybe a little flickering. And yeah, it's a pretty accurate representation of composite. It doesn't have any of the scan lines yet. That's something we'll get into in a minute. For those of you that played back in the 80s and early 90s on old CRTs, like this is what it looked like. It's pretty good. Now, if you happen to mod your NES, you could get S-Video or RGB out of it. So for comparison's sake, here's S-Video. Cleans it up quite a bit, but there's still some color bleed, which is, once again, pretty accurate. And now RGB. And this provides us a nice crisp colors, but it is an analog signal, so there is some noise still left in the emulated picture. But this is very, very, like, it's awesome. It looks very accurate. I'm very pleased with it. So for me personally, I use RGB just because it does look really accurate. And as any of you know who've been watching these tutorials for a while, I love accuracy on these older games. Like, it's so huge to me. But last filter we're gonna look at here is monochrome. And look at that, it's black and white and color bleeding. So very, very accurate. But for me, I'm going to go ahead and swap it back over to RGB. So the next setting we're going to look at is the NES's color palette. So for those of you unaware of the NES, different models of NES's had different color outputs. PlayChoice 10 units had different color palettes, even though it was basically an NES. Nintendo's own NES Mini had a different color palette than what was on regular NESs, so there's a ton of different color palettes that the NES actually had, so you can actually choose between quite a few pre-installed ones here. So we're just going to go ahead and run through a few of them. So first up we have Consumer. This is kind of an estimation of what most retail NESs output. Yeah, it looks pretty good. You can see that there's purple and Donatello, so it looks decent. Next we have Canical. Kind of mutes the colors a little bit, makes it a little more authentic to what some NESs output. Next up is Alternative. And this one kind of has like higher contrasted colors. It looks more reminiscent to the Play Choice 10 units to my eye. And then there's RGB, and this is 100% the Play Choice 10 color scheme right here. Very, very high saturated colors. Looks good on some games, looks really terrible on others. Like, I would never play Mario Brothers with this color palette. It looks awful to me. Whereas Turtles looks actually pretty decent. Next we have the PAL region colors. Apparently PAL region had slightly different color schemes. And yeah, I don't think it's that great looking. Our next palette is from Firebrand X. He actually did a really deep dive into making accurate NES colors, so this was like direct color capture from a composite source to make this color palette. And as you can see, there's the muted colors that the NES outputs. So, I mean, if you remember the NES having more vibrant colors, it really wasn't the case most of the time. It was actually pretty muted. Whereas things like the NES Virtual Console actually uses a more vibrant color palette than what the actual system had. Our next color palette is once again from Firebrand X, and this time it was from using a PVM, and this one looks pretty nice. Still muted, but it's a lot crisper, if that makes sense. Next up we have an Ntsc system from Firebrand X. Still pretty muted. Next up we have the NES Classics color palette that Firebrand X once again provided. And as you can see, when Nintendo did the NES Classic, they did try to make it more accurate to the authentic experience, so good for them. Next up we have the raw capture before the color palette is really even applied, and this is gnarly. Check this out. Oh yeah, who wants to play all of their games looking just like this? No thank you, my eyes are starting to bleed. And next up, if you have an NES color palette that you made yourself, you can actually load them into Retroarch. I'm not familiar with the process behind this. Just know that it is an option, and if you're interested in doing it, just visit the Nestopia core documentation page that we were on earlier, and it has a full setup guide on how you can make your own NES color palettes. So for my tastes, I'm just going to stick to the CXA 2025 color palette because I'm used to the more vibrant colors these days. I really don't prefer the muted presentation all that much anymore. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave mine set to this. Our next core option is to remove the 8 sprite per Scanline hardware limit. So as many of you who play NES games know, there was a ton of sprite flickering if there were too many on screen at one time. This removes that limitation. Everything will appear crisp, clean, and exactly how it should have if the NES had hardware that was capable of it, that it didn't in the time, but emulation thus provides us. Whether or not you want to enable this one is purely personal preference. Our next core option is to overclock the emulated NES speed. So if you have an NES game that suffers from horrible lag, say any of like the Mega Man games, you can overclock the CPU up to 2 times to help reduce that stuttering, so you can pretty much have a lag-free experience in a majority of NES games. It's pretty neat. Next up is the 4-player adapter, so that XML file we put in the system folder earlier should automatically know what games need to have the 4-player adapter, but if for whatever reason it's not doing it correctly, you can set whether you're using an NTSC or a Famicom adapter. and that way you can get the proper 4-player support. So auto should work for a vast majority of the things. If you run across an instance where your 4-player games aren't working right, just choose which system you're using and it'll fix you right up. Our next option is for Famicom disk systems. If you happen to reset a game while you're playing it, this option will make it so it automatically inserts the first disc again instead of you having to go and manually swap things. So just go ahead and leave this one on. Our next core option is about masking vertical and horizontal overscans. So CRTs used to work where part of their image was actually blocked off by the bezel of your TV. So if you turn this off, you can see that we get a lot more extra black screen at the top of the image that would otherwise have been blocked by normal TV. If you want to be able to see every pixel that the NES output, you're going to want to disable this. It's enabled by default, but you're really not missing out on a thing because these are pixels that were never meant to be seen. So as you can see, like the fire at the bottom, the extra black at the top, like it doesn't really add anything to the image. It might be distracting to some of you, I don't know, but I just go ahead and leave the vertical masking on. Now for horizontal overscan, this can really crop out some of your game image on certain games. So this one is really on a case-by-case basis whether or not you're going to use it. So for me, I go ahead and leave this one disabled. Next up, we have aspect ratio controls. So you can choose between NTSC, PAL, 4:3, or auto. So I just go ahead and leave mine on auto, accurate enough for my tastes. Our next core option is actually a pretty interesting one, and that is Game Genie sound distortion. So when you used a Game Genie, it didn't always pass the cartridge audio through accurately and added kind of noise to it. So you can actually emulate that here if you used Game Genie a ton and are just used to the way it sounded actually going through it. So that was actually pretty neat. Next up, we have our favored system. So it's basically what system the games are running on. So you can choose between auto, you can have it running on NTSC NES or a PAL NES or a Famicom or even a Dendy hardware. I just leave it on auto. I haven't found a reason to ever really change it because I usually just stick with NTSC NES games anyway, but I just go ahead and leave it on auto in case I am going to ever play Famicom or a PAL region release. Our next core option is RAM power on state. So just go ahead and leave this on 0x00. Just don't really mess with it, no reason to. The next core option, we have shift A, B, X, and Y clockwise on your controllers. So if you're using an Xbox controller, for example, your A button will be mapped to the B button on the controller, and the B button will be mapped to A on the controller. So you can rotate that, so A will be mapped to A, and B will be mapped to X. The final core option we have is for turbo pulse speed. So this lets us change how fast our turbo button inputs are registered. So the defaults to it goes up to 9, and your X and Y buttons on an Xbox controller double as A and B, but in turbo formation. So if you're using a 4-button controller, you do have turbo buttons, thus you can change how fast they are registered. So now that we've covered all the core options, let's talk about controller options real quick. There really isn't much to go over here because that database file that we put into our system folder earlier will determine what kind of controller we're using. So unlike other cores where you actually have to manually select if you're using a controller or a light gun, Nestopia will decide it automatically for you and switch you over to the proper input. So if you're playing a light gun game, your mouse will automatically become your light gun. Now for the final thing I want to go over when it comes to NES emulation is our shaders. Yes, of course, always the shaders. So thankfully, because Nestopia uses this Blarg Ntsc filter, we don't really need to cover any of the Ntsc shaders this time because we already have an awesome, accurate way of filtering the graphics to look like the proper TV inputs. So for me, again, I'm using RGB. And now I'm going to apply some awesome scan lines to it that look like my Sony Trinitron. So I'm going to go to Load Shader Preset, shaders GLSL. I'm gonna go down to CRT, and we're gonna just load up CRT easy mode. And now the game looks exactly like it does on my Sony Trinitron, and it is pretty friggin' genuine, and I love it. There are, of course, other shader presets you might like besides easy mode. Easy mode just gives you these nice vertical and horizontal scan lines, looks really grid, and I like it. But there are certain other things you can load up. If you had like a curved tube TV, you can still add in some of those things by doing like the geometry shader. And now we've got that curved classic tube TV look, and this is this right here is pretty friggin' accurate and genuine to what I remember playing games on over at my buddy's house a lot too, so. Personal preference, I like having the sharp grid personally, so easy mode is always my preferred shader. But scroll through them, see what you like. Everyone likes different things, so once you do have your shader figured out, go ahead and scroll down to Save Core Preset. So that way every time you load up Nestopia, this is the shader that's going to be done for you. That way you don't have to worry about any additional setup steps if you swap back and forth between multiple cores. And once you're done with that and you have everything on the core set up exactly how you want it to, go ahead and click on Overrides and save core overrides. This way, nothing you do in any other core will affect your Nestopia core. If you don't save the overrides, you might change a setting in a Super Nintendo core that could affect your NES core, so make sure you always save those core overrides to save yourself the headache. You have it working exactly as you want now, override it, that way every time you load it up, this is what you're getting. And there you have it, cycle accurate NES emulation using the Nestopia core inside of Retroarch. This one was pretty easy this week, guys. Let me know down in the comments if you have any questions, anything you'd like to know about, that I may not have covered as in-depth as you'd like. And I just want to thank you all for watching these tutorials. It really does mean the world to me. If you haven't already, if you could go ahead and hit these thumbs up, thumbs down buttons, sub button, and if you might want to support the channel, you can actually click that join button now to become a backer of the channel. I do exclusive live streams every week for anyone who backs the channel, and you get access to channel exclusive emotes. So if you're interested in supporting the channel that way, an option. But thank you all so much again. Enjoy playing your NES games. Game freaking on, my friends, and we will see you all back next video.